I am also very excited, and I'm gonna say let's get started. And Hetty, you're gonna start us off.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Harmony and Alex, for all your work putting this together. I'm Hetty Blades. I'm a researcher in the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University in the UK. My presentation today is called Coming Together Through Movement Apart, and I have some slides. So I'm just going to organise my screen sharing. Katie Coe kneels on the floor of her daughter Tala's bedroom and slowly folds at the waist. The camera zooms in on her hands as they trail across the floor and her torso moves towards the bed. In the background, Tala sits on her bed looking at a laptop. Coe slowly pushes her body onto the bed, folding smoothly into it and rolling across as she reaches for the wall on the other side. Here she pauses, her head resting against Tala's legs. During a moment of stillness, the bedclothes are in sharp focus in the foreground of the shot, with Coe's figure softened into the background. After the pause, she resumes movement, rolls swiftly off the bed, and crawls backwards out of the room. I'm witnessing Perch, a dance made by dance artist Amy Voris between 2014 and 2019, and adapted for Coe to perform in her house and garden and online during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'm going to discuss Perch, and in particular, the role that the score played in facilitating the adaptation of the work during lockdown. In the longer version of this paper, which is coming out in the special issue, I also discuss Room Roof Piece, which is a reworking of Trisha Brown's Roof Piece. And both Room Roof Piece and Perch are versions of works that pre-existed the pandemic, but that were adapted and reperformed during this period, primarily online. So although they're different in many ways, they both use scores as a means to adapt and share the works. And I'm interested in how the scores enabled, in these particular examples, the formation and continuation of bonds between members of dance communities while they couldn't meet in person. And I'm using the term score here in a really broad sense to mean a spoken, written, drawn entity that underpins movement or provides kind of parameters for movement. Both the scores that I discuss in the paper are physical scores and are inscribed through writing. So my slides today include a series of images of Amy Voris and Katie Coe. Amy's here on the left in purple, and those are Katie Coe's legs as she disappears out of the window. These images were taken by photographer Christian Kipp, so I just really want to say a big thank you to Christian and Amy and Katie for giving me permission to share them. In the UK, the term dance community is commonly used to refer to a single, albeit amorphous collection of people associated with different styles of dance and in different ways to dance. It could be said to include dancers and choreographers, but also teachers, programmers, audiences, critics, technicians, researchers, and so on. And although this term is commonly used to refer to a single group, there are also many small communities within this kind of overarching notion of community. And these might resolve, for example, around particular styles, genres, practices, geographical locations, shared social or cultural experiences, particular institutions. My interest is really on these two kind of specific examples of community arising through people moving together. Writing about the notion of community in relation to dance, practitioner and scholar Funmi Adewale suggests, and I'm quoting here, as you can see on the slide, community is a complex and layered term, meaning different things in different places. A factor that seems to be common to most definitions of community is that a community consists of people who are considered to be a collective, but this could be on the basis of shared background, heritage, experience, or circumstances. And she adds, I'd like to add the caveat that my descriptions of community should not be taken as being a sociological proven fact, but as a banner under which to discuss good practices. And I think this really is a really helpful articulation of the way that this notion is kind of commonly used in dance and kind of encompasses this idea of dance community that has many different communities within it. And I particularly also think this idea of collectivity is very useful. Communities that are formed on the basis of shared practices can be understood as communities of practice. Etienne Wenger describes communities of practice as, quote, formed by people who engage in a process of collective learning in a shared domain of human endeavour. And this is a concept also discussed by Adewale in relation to dance. She describes dance artist Alessandra Souten's workshop programme for dance practitioners at École de Sable in Senegal as an example of a community of practice. And again, community of practice is, I think, another really helpful notion for thinking about the types of community relations that I look at in this paper. So Room Roof Piece, as I mentioned, it's a reworking of Trisha Bound's Roof Piece, during which performers enact a simple follow the leader structure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work. It was originally performed on the rooftops of New York in 1971 and then adapted for Zoom last year in 2020. And a score for the adaptation was published online by Brian Seibert in the New York Times, and some people responded to this score to make their own versions. And in the longer paper, I look at this example in relation to Harmony Bench's articulation of the way that dance media facilitates and makes visible acting in common. So I'm really interested in how the score enables connections between people when they're dancing together, but also with other people who have performed the work, so kind of connections through time. However, that's a kind of brief preview of the longer paper, and for the rest of today's presentation, I'm going to focus more on the second example of Perch. Voris describes Perch as, quote, a solo dance about temporary states and locations and the movement in between those things. It's about the process of homing while feeling haunted by the past. First and foremost, however, Perch is a practice performed regularly by one person for a place. And she describes in her PhD thesis how the work was made over a period of 4 years and approximately 120 practice sessions. And it was first performed in her studio in Manchester in the north of the UK. So starting in March 2020, during the UK's first period of lockdown, Voris & Co undertook a series of 30 to 40 rehearsals, primarily online, with the aim of adapting Voris's score for Perch for Co to perform in her house and garden in Kenilworth, which is in the Midlands in the UK. And Perch was then later performed by Co in her house with 1 or 2 audience members at a time who follow her as she moves through her house and into the garden. And the work was also adapted for online screening via Zoom, which is the version of the work that I have seen. This version starts with Co standing outside her house. She leads us into the house and sits down. She explains the history of Perch and what will happen during this performance. She then posts a link in the Zoom chat to a recorded film of the work, which is shot by Christian Kipp, who took these images in a single take on a handheld camera. So the way that it's shot with Kipp following Co around the house means that we really get this sense of kind of experiencing her moving through the house in real time. We're told to keep our Zoom connection running while we watch the recording and to come back together afterwards, turning on our cameras to signify that we finished watching. Co moves through the different rooms of her house, starting at the top in her daughter's bedroom, as I previously described, before moving to the bathroom, her own bedroom, taking us downstairs to her living room, through the kitchen and into the garden. The focus of the camera moves between close-ups of her body parts as they connect with the surfaces of her house and zoomed out capture of the whole space that she inhabits. As with Room Roof Piece and many other online performances during the pandemic, the adaptation of Perch takes place in a domestic setting. However, rather than the house and garden being a backdrop to the movement, they're central parts of the work, and you can see Co on the right here in her garden. As Voris makes clear in the description I mentioned previously, Perch is performed for a place, meaning the relationship between the movement and the place it's performed is really central to the practice. The systematic way that Co travels through the house from top to bottom and into the garden appears to me to indicate a predefined structure for the work. It doesn't have the purely spontaneous feel of an improvised work, yet there's an emergent quality to Co's movement that suggests to me that the movement themselves are not entirely determined in advance of the performance. However, when I later watched footage of Perch performed by Voris on her website, I noticed that some of the movement content between the two versions overlaps. So it seems then that this emergent quality of the movement is part of the practice of Perch, rather than indicating that the movement is entirely improvised in the performance. In her thesis, Forrest described how the score for Perch was developed iteratively over her long making process. She describes it as inscribing the, quote, processual qualities, end quote, that underpin the work. The score, which is also in the thesis, is titled A Poetic Score, and it captures these processual qualities in a written style that's akin to what Alison D'Amato terms indeterminate language scores, in the way that the prompts are non-didactic and open to multiple interpretations. The score begins: seahorse sidestep, sideways stepping, mapping, internal readying, listening to the intricacies of sound, deep abdominals, responsiveness in legs, breaking up ground. So you can see here how the language used doesn't prescribe a specific set of movements, but it does have some movements mentioned, such as sideways stepping. So there is some movement content that's there, but of course, sideways stepping can be interpreted in multiple different ways. So Coe and Voris discussed with me how each rehearsal for the adaptation involved a series of what they call warm-ups or preparatory activities prior to working on the score. These activities were concerned with creating a shared space between Voris and Coe. And once this space had been established with activities, Voris talks of feeling very connected to Coe. And following this kind of process of connection building, they'd then start to work on the adaptation of the score. So establishing these conditions for the practice was really key to the adaptation, but the score itself was also really central to the project, and in particular because of the conditions of lockdown and the way that they were adapting the score at a distance from one another. So Coe describes how the existence of the score enabled the project to happen. The two of them had been discussing working on something new, but didn't feel it was possible during lockdown, whereas adapting an existing score gave them a way into working together. And Voris suggests also that working only with these processual qualities was too open for remote working. So although the score had originally been intended only as a tool for Voris, it became really key to enabling the adaptation and allowing them to enter into this shared practice. So we might think of movement scores, one way of thinking about them is as a kind of externalization of some of the principles of a work. However, as both Anna Pakes and Miriam van Imschoot have pointed out, there are likely other agreements that need to take place before the work can be fully realized. And I think you can see that here in this example of Perch, that there are other aspects of the practice, decisions, agreements that need to be undertaken for the work to be fully adapted, and the score is kind of one part of that process. Some recent scholarship in dance has drawn attention to the role of agreements in dance making, and I'm thinking here of Anna Pakes' book, Choreography Invisible, also of joint commitment in dancing together, such as Elia Vidrin's PhD thesis, and intention and action in the making of dance, such as Graham McPhee's most recent book, Dance and the Philosophy of Action. Furthermore, as Alessandro Salas points out, common views in the field of social ontology see shared intention or intentional action as central to the constitution of social groups. And I think these views are particularly interesting in relation to these scores and their kind of enabling of shared action. However, Salas explains how Dietrich von Hildebrand draws attention away from the relevance of shared intention within communities in particular. He explains Hildebrand's position that instead of shared intention being kind of central to the constitution of a community, his emphasis is on the role of values, or what he terms the unifying virtue. So Sally summarizes how values might act in the kind of forming of communities. I'm quoting here. If a number of persons is working on the same problem, feeling its value, then they're incorporated into in the same value of the same axiological domain, and hence they're already unified. Such constitution proceeds by means of ontological necessity and does not rest unto the individual awareness of being a member of a group, however this may be conceived. So there's a lot to kind of unpack in that, but I just want to focus in on this idea of the shared domain, and this kind of overlaps with Wenger's idea about communities of practice that I mentioned earlier. So according to Salis, a shared goal has a particular value, and it's sharing the experience of this value or entering the same axiological domain that unifies people, whether or not they're aware of each other. And I think this is a really helpful idea for thinking more about how community bonds might form. So by engaging with something and experiencing the value of that thing in relation to others, this axiological domain is created, and through which connection can arise. So, for example, we might think about the conditions generated through Boris and Co's warm-ups as the two of them cultivating a shared domain, not only of practice, but also a shared axiological domain, and that perhaps it's this kind of combination that leads to this sense of connection described by Boris. I also think this explanation can perhaps shed light on how the performers of Room Roof piece might be drawn into relations with other people enacting the score or performing Room Roof piece at different times, as they can all be said to share an axiological domain without necessarily being aware of one another. So I can see I'm coming towards the end of my time, so I'm going to pop the references on the screen and just give a kind of brief word of conclusion. So according to Salis, Hildebrand stresses values rather than shared intention in the constitution or formation of communities. However, in relation to this example, I suggest the score offers a kind of concrete focus for the shared intention to practice together and enabled the practice over distance, and that it's through the practice that a shared axiological domain is created, meaning that both values and shared intention underpin the connections formed and maintained as part of the perch adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hetty. Joe, and if you have questions that are specific to Hetty, go ahead and put them in the chat now if you like. Joe, thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, Hetty. Thanks for that. I'm looking forward to reading. Hi, everyone. I'm Jo Cork. I'm a screen dance practitioner. I'm based in London. I work in screen dance. I'm very interested in dance and technology and the varying applications of screen dance as well, and how we might use that to reach wider audiences. I'm going to be talking to you today about a piece that I've written, which is a review of Tom, which is a dance film made by Wilkie Branson. It was originally created to be a screen dance installation within Sadler's Wells, and was more of an immersive experience and would be displayed on various silver threaded transparent screens in a space. So you might imagine it's more of an episodic work in that format, and perhaps more immersive as well. The way that all of that information comes to the viewer is the viewer has more autonomy over that perhaps, and receives it in slightly different arrangements. COVID hit just before that exhibition was due to go live, and so the film was reappropriated, or the work was reappropriated as a dance film. And I understand that was always the intention eventually, but with the circumstances, it happened much sooner and much faster than planned. And it was aired or screened as part of Sadler's digital stage in May in 2020, so fairly early on in proceedings. And so I'm going to touch on a few key points that I talk about in the review, and hopefully through my talking about that, you'll understand or come to understand why it is that I felt very compelled to write about that work, and why I feel it's an incredibly important piece of screen dance work, and speaks a lot about where we might be going in the future with it. So I'll quickly share just a screen grab, one of the title slides from the film. So hopefully you can see that there, and you can see in that shot some of the aesthetic of the film. It's a very, very visceral film. It has a lot of the gaming aesthetic about it, and that's generated through multiple image making processes, including photogrammetry and chroma key capture and animation. And it also involves some 360-degree filming as well. And it's the layering of these processes with multiple softwares going in and out of different softwares that arrives at this kind of an image. And there's something really, I think, really important about that in terms of the viewer's orientation in the film and how immersed they feel in it. And I think that's partly to do with people's memory of gaming. And for those who have come to adulthood with gaming, there is that familiarity of being actually in a world rather than something just being presented to you. And so I think that does a large amount of work in allowing the viewer an experiential engagement with the work rather than a witnessing engagement with the work, which is something that for me is what I love about the potential of screen dance. I think it can be really amazing and is kind of crucial in many senses. The sound too is also there's a very clear sonic language that helps bring us in. And the way that the choreography of the camera, the way that the camera moves also does a huge amount to bring us to a spatial understanding of our surroundings, again, allowing us to feel enveloped in that film. And the subject of the film, we're very much following the journey of a man's psyche. And the subject of that, of course, relates to, the idea of loneliness is something that is resonating in those early COVID times very much with a lot of people and perhaps with a wider audience than might have otherwise. But I think what's really exciting for me about this film is the potentials and the liberations that I think it offers with the use of those technological developments and how those developments have interacted with practices of choreography for camera and practices of choreographing within the edit that open us up to or give light to lots of different potentials that we could go towards in the future. And something that I think is really important as well about it is the length of it. It's 55-minute film, much longer than usual. And although it remains abstract and maintains that nature of dance that we're very familiar with and doesn't kind of shoehorn itself into a narrative, there are many narrative anchors within it that accumulate a lot of symbolic meaning, and I think they act as something very important for a mainstream audience to be able to follow through the work and helps them attach to something that's more familiar so that they can engage with the work so fully. So I think one of the main questions that comes out of it for me in response to the time that it was released is that with so much exposure and so much discovery of screen dance in this last year, could there be a place for works like this that do to some degree bridge the gap between what a viewer of niche work and what a viewer of mainstream work expects, to allow screen dance work to be seen on more mainstream platforms? And that's my main question. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Jo. Archer, when you're ready, we're ready for you.
Hey guys, sorry. I just got out of the shower. My hair's all wet, but I am Archer Porter. I am a PhD candidate at UCLA. The title of my presentation is The Home Buddy in/during crisis. So I'm just going to share my screen real fast. And present. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Eliza grooves to a pop song in her living room. Miguel jams out in his bedroom to a new album by his favorite musician. Cam rehearses a piece of choreography in the kitchen. Self-produced home dance videos such as these circulate new media platforms in abundance. Together, these productions reflect the extraordinary ordinariness of domestic life, the outward expression of intimacy on new media, and the slippages in private and public space, which have become characteristic of contemporary digital culture. At the crux of this phenomenon is the home dancing body. This body, the home body, we might say, straddles worlds of familiar and unfamiliar, near and far, interior and exterior, personal and social. The home dance videos that appear online not only capture this body, but also exacerbate its inherent paradoxes of space, subjectivity, and sociality. We might imagine, for instance, how Eliza, Miguel, and Cam, these fictional denizens of new media, take care to capture their private selves and express their interior thoughts. Their space, too, reflects their interior, intimate worlds. A photo of Eliza's grandmother hangs on the wall behind her. Miguel's dog hides under the bed next to him. And Cam's still damp mop rests against the oven, perhaps from an earlier cleaning spree. Yet once posted to the internet, these media acquire a new dimension that is often antithetical to their semiotics of intimacy. That is, while they typically remain tethered to personal accounts, they are also thrust into public visibility and mass circulation, accumulating views and likes, inviting reposts and shares, and collecting comments and hashtags. The phenomenon of home dance videos is not new, of course, but may be linked to the rise of new media and along with it, the cultivation of what I term the domestic stage. Associated with platforms like Instagram and TikTok, productions on the domestic stage borrow from genres like autobiography and self-portraiture and extend the logics of antecedent media like home movies and closed-circuit television. The homebody may appear through these media, choreographing its interior for the exterior, expressing its privacy for the public and harnessing the personal for the social. Despite its genealogies across media, history, and genre, the homebody and the domestic stage upon which it performs have been reframed by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Accompanying the global movement toward quarantining and staying at home throughout 2019 to 2021, home dance videos not only proliferated in number, but also prompted an intensification of the homebody. This paper examines the transformations and new offerings of the mediatized homebody during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. By analyzing the Instagram account of dancer Marley Grace and the videos she posted before and during quarantine, it argues that this global crisis has exacerbated the existing paradoxes and complexities of the homebody, while also recharging this figure with an overt criticality. But before considering the ways in which Grace's home productions demonstrate this argument, however, let's first consider the notion of the homebody and its place in digital culture. The homebody, more than merely a person who finds pleasure in staying at home, is the product of the dialectical relation between the habitat and the habitus. That is to say, the home is a space where individuals cultivate and rehearse the habits they inherit from and carry out into the world. Subtly, over time and space, the homebody embodies social structures while also ultimately contributing to those structures. This give and take process results in a body defined by what Pierre Bourdieu terms the habitus, or, quote, a system of durable transposable dispositions, end quote. The homebody, drawing on Bourdieu, is a corporeal manifestation of social constructedness, the everyday micro-developments of gender, class, race, sexuality that are cultivated through domestic space and expressed through the body. However, the homebody also reimagines itself in the confines of its space, testing its limits and tweaking its habits. This figure moves in and through the home, secured by the familiarity of its surroundings, yet excited by the world beyond its walls. Though it is subject to normative patternings, it is also compelled by the possibility of deviation. In this way, the homebody is not only public, private, personal, social, but also reiterative, subversive. The homebody is indeed paradoxical. Not only does it embody the structures of its environment, thereby enmeshing itself into social fabrics, but it also interfaces with the public through screens. For the 21st century homebody in particular, screens have become an apparatus of habitualization. The homebody maneuvers itself in front of screens, just as it becomes the image on screens. In fact, we may argue that it is only through screens that the homebody may appear in the first place, since once it physically exits its domestic world, it becomes evacuated of its defining characteristics. In other words, the homebody cannot be outside of the home. However, by remaining in its habitat, positioning itself in front of a camera and pressing record, it may mediate and transmit itself and its choreographies. Through screens, then, this figure comes to know the world just as the world comes to know it. Its production and consumption of screen media then comprise its habitual exercises. Voices, bodies, and scenes from afar are drawn into its habitat, and they shape its habitus. The contemporary homebudy's relationship to screens demonstrates how it is defined by what Wendy Chun calls habitual new media, a paradigm of network society in which the individual is compelled to constantly change, so much so that updating becomes the only constant. Users have become creatures of the update, writes Chun. To be is to be updated. To update is to be subjected to the update. Now, however oxymoronic it may seem, habitual change, Chun suggests, has come to define how people operate in the age of new media. Perhaps digital culture's imposition for us all is to make a habit of change. Drawing on Chun's conceptualization, the homebody is embedded in a landscape of habitual change. This body symbolizes the desire for yet impossibility of stability in the fluid conditions of digital culture. Its habits, of course, manifest through corporeal movement, through patterns and sequences, through choreographies of both an ordinary and extraordinary variety. Evident in this understanding of the homebody is how, even without the stresses of a global crisis, this figure is already imbued with contradictions, ambiguities, and paradoxes. It is subject to both work and leisure, commerce and craft, social interaction, and intimate engagement. Then in 2020, as millions of people across the world receded from public spaces and closed themselves in at home, the homebody was propelled into a global public consciousness. Everyone, it seemed, was cognizant of, if not experiencing on a personal level, the complexities of the homebody. This movement, however, not only cast a brighter light on the homebody, but also intensified its already inherent paradoxes. The ways in which this figure stretches across spheres of inside and outside were exacerbated by the nature of the pandemic, concerns for the health of the body, feelings of both confinement and refuge, new rhythms of work, family, and leisure, desires for yet an uncertainty around social engagement. Because these changes compounded on and around and through the body, testing it beyond its limits and twisting it in new directions, the homebody became the site of much attention and tension. It was within this field that home dance videos began to circulate with greater frequency and fervor. Like the shifts in the homebody during this time, the general character of these videos also shifted. Specifically, they tended to acquire a greater sense of urgency, a marked dissonance, and an express politics. Marley Grace's video posted in April 2020 is no exception to this trend. Her homebody in this particular post performed the exaggerated complexities that developed during the pandemic. This 17-second video was uploaded to Instagram on April 8th, 2020, the same day that the United States, Grace's country of residence, reported 200,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus, and just days after the country announced a record number of filings for unemployment benefits. Upon initial viewing, Grace doesn't seem to be cognizant of these current events. That is to say, when first considering the video, her homebody seems to be insulated from its social, cultural, and economic context. However, reading into her post reveals the complexities of her homebody and indicates the ways in which dance may be positioned as a critical practice in times of crisis, particularly compared to its social life on new media prior to the pandemic. Most notable about this post is its seemingly contradictory semiotics, particularly the mood of the video compared to the message of the caption. Grace's dancing does not read as solemn, grim, bored, or chaotic, sentiments commonly expressed during the height of the pandemic. Instead, the quality of her movements, her choice in music, and her countenance throughout the dance all suggest effervescence. This characterization may be gleaned in how she jauntily bobs to the upbeat rhythm of the song Boom, 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 Boom by the Venga Boys, which she sings along to the lyrics with ease and strikes her arms with an upbeat, lighthearted energy. The manner with which Grace enters the frame, as if introducing her hands first, then the rest of her body, expresses playfulness. Together, these facets of her performance articulate a light-hearted sensibility that encourages the viewer to dance and sing along. The effervescence and ease of Grace's dancing stands in opposition to the statements she makes in the caption of the post. While the mood of the dancing is lively, that of the caption is melancholic. Grace notes several current events that prompted viral expressions of grief on new media, along with her own despair during the pandemic. Perhaps, however, she is dealing with these events in a non-obvious, non-superficial manner. As she recognizes in the post, dance is a mode through which she may acknowledge and navigate grief, and most of all, to quote unquote, move it through the body. Her experience of grooving to a pop song then is perhaps an exercise in moving that grief through her body, so much so that the result does not appear to be grief at all. Considering this view, perhaps the stark contrast of seemingly divergent sentiments turns out to be a commingling of those sentiments. The channeling of grief through the body as a way to recognize it, live with it, and to momentarily transform it into something else. The homebody during crisis, as Grace teaches us, can simultaneously feel both pleasure and despair, rhythm and quiet, levity and gravity. The home dance videos that Grace posted prior to the pandemic tend to express a more cohesive, non-contradictory homebody. Captions of videos contextualized the dancing in the video or explained a sensibility that was already available in the dance. While numerous home dance videos that Grace posted across several years demonstrate this pre-pandemic homebody, we might consider just a few. On June 21st, 2019, for example, Grace posted a video in which she does the floss. The caption under the video reads, "Just trying to figure out what the moves everyone's into. I know I'm late, I'm doing my best." Earlier that year, on February 16th, 2019, Grace posted a video of her jauntily grooving in her living room. The caption appropriately reads, "Home as everywhere, home as where I can listen to Sean Paul." And then in a post from October 28th, 2018, Grace dances to the Flying Lizards. And just below the video, she writes, "What's up with today?" While these posts are not bereft of meaning or criticality, they channel a homebody that is more at ease with the world, at ease with the interior, at ease with domesticity. Grace often remarks on her impression of a particular musical artist, song, or album. She will also occasionally reflect on the weather or an item of clothing. Dissonance, however, is not a theme available in these posts, and dance does not need to be deployed to cast any spells or otherwise cope with the events of the outside world. Instead, dance functions as a pastime, a leisure activity, and a pop culture currency. And the homebody presents itself as in balance and at peace. Analyzing Marley Grace's Instagram activity both during and before the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates the complexities of the homebody and how the pandemic both reveals and exacerbates those complexities. Though her case exemplifies this point, it does not exhaust the myriad twists, turns, and protractions that the homebody exercises on new media. In fact, the complexity of this figure acquires a meta status, so a complexity of complexity, when considering how identity plays into its choreographies, how race, class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, nationality, and other social categories define its dealings across the private, public, personal, social, and interior, exterior. Aggregated by hashtags like quarantine dance and social disdancing are videos of individuals dancing in their bedrooms, living rooms, and kitchens, in homes across continents, in a variety of dance styles and with a range of sentiments. Then with the pandemic, the particularities of the homebody experience changes that are also unique to the dancer's situation and identity position. Marley Grace is merely one pixel in this larger moving portrait. At the same time, as I've discussed, the homebody is already paradoxical, already complex, already contradictory, even outside of the social, cultural, economic, and political constraints of the pandemic. Our global predicament has illuminated and intensified these contours, but not redraw them. So while the widespread pivot toward the home in 2020 indeed placed added stress on the homebody, prompting individuals across the globe to experience domesticity in a new, amplified way, we might also argue that to some extent, the homebody has always been in crisis. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and take this off.
Thank you so much, Archer. So next we have Catherine.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Archer. I feel like that presentation connects to what I have to offer today in some really interesting ways. So I'm so thankful to meet everyone actually through this platform. My name is Catherine Cabine, and I am Zooming to you right now from unceded Lenape land, currently known as Brooklyn, New York. I am an associate professor at Marymount Manhattan College, and though I greatly appreciated Harmony's introduction to this panel, I am in no way a leader in the screen dance world. I am someone who was dragged kicking and screaming into this world at the beginning of the pandemic crisis, and the viewpoint that I wrote for this particular issue is very much sort of in response to that positionality. So I just want to own it and also say that my hat is so entirely off to the brilliance and creativity of people who've been engaged in this field for longer than it was something that we were sort of forced into. But what I felt as a dance professor, as the world shut down and there was a sudden avalanche of online content, was that the institution that I work for really strove to replicate the product-based, capitalist performance idea of dance and create screen dance, make the students who have no experience in this create screen dance, ask faculty who has no experience in this incredible field to mentor students completely outside of anyone's knowledge base. And it struck me as a real missed opportunity. First of all, a missed opportunity to better integrate with communities like this one where people have been thinking about this for a minute, but also a missed opportunity to really give students the chance to celebrate what it is they do have within their bodies. And this real drive to celebrate dance as a product rather than a process, and dance as having value because it is seen as opposed to having value because it is experienced, pushed me to create the viewpoint that I wrote, which is called Honoring the Unseen. At the same time, as I was sort of watching this push, there were also a bunch of articles coming out that probably all of you are aware of, those of you who are educators, that there's a huge mental health crisis that's coming along with the pandemic. And I was really struck not only by reading about that in a larger field, but also in the evidence of that was in front of me in every class that I have taught for the last over a year now, in terms of the trauma that is inherent in this moment. And it's really felt important to me to encourage students to remember that movement and dance are these incredible tools for emotional self-regulation, that dance is an antidepressant, that within our breathing, living bodies is an incredible toolbox for wellness. And what I have found is that when the students are feeling that their only value is in being seen, they forget to slow down and breathe and take advantage of the fact that we are multidimensional, incredibly complex beings. And particularly in relation to the huge uprisings in response to injustice around racial profiling and violence, I was really encouraging everyone that I worked with and myself to slow down and make space for complexity and allow there to be a little bit more breathing room around our reactions to things and the content that we decide to put out there into the world. And so what I offer is just a real opportunity to celebrate process in the body. What I wrote is a very sort of somatic writing from the body celebration of how our bodies, which are complex and multidimensional, can help us to digest and process the incredible chaos and confusion and complexity of the world that we're all trying to navigate. And within that, to really uplift dance as a tool in that process. And so I'm just doing a flash talk today, so I only have like, a couple minutes, but I wanted to actually just take the last little minute of my time here to invite everyone to do a brief somatic meditation with me. If you don't want to, you can just ignore me and go get some more coffee. That's fine too. But I invite you, if you're up for it, to just allow yourself to actually change your posture. So you're maybe not staring at a screen for a second, to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you, and to take a big deep breath in and out, letting it go. Tune into the sensation of your pelvis in relation to the chair that you're sitting on, or if you're standing, feel the soles of your feet. And just allow yourself to have a moment of grounding. Take a deep breath in and let it go. And then without losing that grounding, I invite you to feel into the crown of the head and allow the crown of the head to aspire upwards so that you can feel an elongation of the vertical axis of the body from the pelvic floor through the crown of the head. And as you inhale, allow your diaphragm to ride along that vertical axis, grounding you with the inhale. And as you exhale, the diaphragm rises. You can feel that gentle softening through your torso. Take another deep breath into that vertical axis, feeling the connection between the pelvic floor and the crown of the head. And exhale, letting go. And then I invite you, if you're able, to bring your hands to the sides of your rib cage. And as you inhale, feel the ribs expanding along that horizontal axis. Feeling yourself expand from side to side. And as you exhale, feel the ribs dropping back towards the center line. Once again, deep breath in, feeling that horizontal expansion. And exhale, drawing and organizing your energy towards the center. And then again, if you're able, I invite you to bring one hand to your belly and the other to your lower back. And as you inhale, you can feel your belly gently softening and expanding. And as you exhale, you might feel the muscles of your core supporting that exhale, drawing towards your center. Take another deep breath in to the hand that's in front and the hand that's behind you, really feeling into that anterior, posterior axis. And exhale, feeling your depth. You can change which hand is in front and which one is behind. Just noticing that asymmetry within the body, and take a few more breaths here into your depth, particularly because as I saw a lot of shifting into the screen, the vertical axis and the horizontal axis continued to be utilized, but this depth, this anterior posterior axis, can often get lost. So just taking a few more deep breaths into that three-dimensionality. And then releasing your hands, blinking your eyes back open, noticing how this attention to posture and breath makes you feel. And then we'll turn back into the space together, and I invite you to continue to play with your posture as you're listening. Such a pleasure to meet you all in this context. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine, for reminding us of our own three-dimensionality as we encounter each other in this flat space. Claire.
So yeah, really thank you, Catherine, because I think it's going to really nicely with what I'm going to talk about. My name is Claire Boussoine. I'm an anthropologist, a filmmaker, and a dancer, and I'm a visiting research fellow at Goldsmith University. And first, before I wanted to start, I actually wanted to ask all of you to really pay attention to your body and your body sensation, but also the space around you while I'm talking and what you're listening and watching me. And I'd like you to, for example, it could be just touch, what you're touching as you're sitting, how you close that touching your skin, but also the sounds beyond my voice, the sound in a room, outside the room. And similar to what Catherine has been inviting, I'd like you to really listen to your body. And I really would like to invite you to feel comfortable to just go in any position you want to go. You might have seen me earlier trying to relax, and I find it really hard to be fixed watching the screen. So please be relaxed. I won't take that badly if you want to change your position. So my invitation to you is, can you keep your awareness to all of this as you're listening and watching me? And how can you receive what I'm talking about from your body? And the reason why I'm asking this is that I'm going to talk about how to remain more embodied with the screen. And current research point out that when we're using the screen, our attention is distracted away, and we're not so much aware what's going on around us. And maybe it's happened to you before, that you're in a street and there's someone really absorbing their phone and they're walking towards you and they have no idea that you're in the front of them. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. But what I'm going to argue here is that we can actually reconcile, being with the screen, our body, and the environment. Before this, I'm saying that we need to critically question our relationship to the screen as a movement practice in its own right. As a movement practice that asks, how can I connect with others via the screen? Because that's what we do, without losing awareness to our own body and the environment around where we are right now. And you might want to keep that in mind as you are listening and watching me. And I explore this question in a series of movement classes I offered on Zoom during the lockdown. And really the aim for me of the class was, how can we find a creative opportunity in this medium that has obvious limits? So we used to teach movement or practice movement in a physical space where we're all together. And when we're on Zoom, we can say, it's not the same. It doesn't work the way it usually does. So rather than to fight with that, I was like, how can we just move and discover what this medium is, what it has to offer? So I really invited people to explore that medium. And what really felt unique about Zoom is that we weren't just dancers and movers on Zoom. Suddenly we became filmmakers and camera operators, that we wanted it or not, because the way we were in the screen was framing how we moved. So, and that was due to the self-view feature, which is like a mirror, so we can see ourselves. But the interesting thing is that if projected to others, we can see our own image, and then vice versa, we can see their own image that they're seeing. So I'm arguing that Zoom is offering this unusual situation of moving selfies in dialogue, where dance and filmmaker converge. And when we're practicing screen dance in an immediate and interactive manner. So I'm going to quickly demonstrate some of those things. And if you want, you can, if your video is not turned on, you can do that. But some of the things I invited people to do is just to realize how you're moving in space is changing what's happening on screen, and the effect it happens when you're much closer or much further away. If I just want one part of my body in the screen or not. But also, as I'm moving in space, I realize that there is a field of view of the screen, and it really changes how I interact with the space, and I know where the border is when I'm in shots and when I'm not. And kind of, so that also shapes how I'm moving with the space, and I'm more aware of that. And also working with just having the camera in different positions, and just also kind of just exploring what that changed in terms of what we're doing. And the last one is also moving with the frame as, another way. It's not just a fixed frame, but it's something that I'm interacting with. So I'm just, that's some of the things that we explored, and it felt really necessary to get a feel of a medium. But then what became really obvious is by really interacting with a screen, it was also narrowing our attention away from our own bodies and what was going on around. It was suddenly, it's like our body and the environment only existed on screen. It was just the only thing that was interesting. And that was exacerbated by this self-view feature that made people more self-conscious, but also it created a divide. It was like my own image, or the idea I have of myself was different from my body and what I was feeling. So this becomes, what I argue is this becomes a situation where we focus so much on being self in relation to others via the screen, that we forget that we are also self in relation to the environment, that we are a body, what I call a body among the seeing. And this idea of a body among the seeing, a body that is not external to it, comes from my practicing Amerta movement with the Indonesian movement artist Suprapto Suryodamo and also Sandra Reeve, who is in the UK. And I brought this practice to the Zoom environment, and I developed 3 concepts from it. And the first one is what I call seeing with the whole body. The second one is moving with a sense of diffuse awareness. And the third one is body as a shape-shifting frame. And seeing with the whole body is really the idea that in the West we have this bias that vision is the primary sense that we perceive everything. And we sort of undermined over the role of the senses, but also the role of the whole body beyond the eyes in how we receive the world. And the frame, interesting, is even more restricted. This idea of perception is only focal and visual because it's restricted to the frame. So I really wanted people to understand that we're working with the bias of what that is. And I work with a lot of different ideas, but I'll just quickly describe 2 of them that I work with. And the first one is that I used my own practice of what I call embodied filmmaking. And one of them is just really simple. It's just when I'm filming with a camera, I'm really learning to move with a camera as my dance partner. And the practice is actually to learn to dance with this object, learning the balance, what is this object, but also being aware that this object as an eye that is seeing out. And the practice is just to not look through the viewfinder, so more just have an awareness where it's pointing. And also have the awareness that when I'm moving in this way, I'm holding the audience in my hand. And how do I want the audience to feel as I'm moving? And sometimes I want to challenge them. Sometimes I want to be very gentle. And then the second one is that I created a series of movement score for participants to experience synesthesia in seeing. The fact that when we see, all the senses also play a part in our experience of seeing, but we often not aware of it. And in order to make that more part of, for people to experience that, I did very simple score, but that just required time to experience. So I just asked people to close their eyes and just really experience, for example, touch and the different quality of touch. So it could be like really touching the wood that is really hard, but also the sense of air that is much softer, and then my clothes that are also a bit more fluid. And then the fact that what's the difference between the active touch, I'm going to touch something, and a passive touch or something that's touching me. And just really going through, guiding them to go through in details. And then after a while, asking them to open their eyes and just asking them to keep those sensations, and then just taking insight. If it's too much, close your eyes again, then come back, and then inviting them to keep those 2 things at the same time, which could be quite overwhelming for people. It will be a big shift when the eyes will be open. So before I carry on further, I just would like to remind you what I asked you at the beginning, and just checking with yourself, how are you feeling in your own body, and what do you need right now, and what's your awareness of what's happening also behind you on the side. And the second concept I'm going to talk about is moving with a sense of diffuse awareness. And it comes back to this idea I was saying, that we have this tendency to pay attention in a visual and focal manner to what's happening. And obviously the screen totally exacerbates that, but we're less aware of that we also pay attention to what's around us in a non-visual and non-focused manner. So the practice of moving with a sense of diffuse awareness is quite simple, but it's very overwhelming. It's more the idea there's lots of things that are happening. As I say, there is a great variety of touch, but it's the same with sound. Some's coming far, closer. It's the sensation on my body, maybe that old pain I have. And then these thoughts and feeling, and trying to keep all these things in mind, being aware of a space behind me, not just what's in front of me. And although we can never, how to say, hold all these things in our awareness at the same time, it's like a practice you can never achieve. By encouraging people to do that, I wanted them to give equal value to their body, the environment, and the screen, and just be aware that the screen and what happens on screen is just one element of what's happening. And also by doing that, it was helping them to realize to notice when they will give too much attention to something and lose awareness of other things. So it's more to sort of be aware. So there's no right and wrong, it's just more be aware when we're losing that awareness, or when we're making those choices. So we have more choices by knowing we're making them. And the last concept I want to talk about is this body as a shape-shifting frame, which is basically the idea that we are the frame ourselves. We're not external to it. As we know, I'm looking at this frame and I think I'm not a frame, but I am, and I'm also shaping it with my body. So it's the idea that we're always seeing the world from the perspective of our body, its senses, its memories, its social and cultural conditioning. And filmmaking is actually a very useful practice to become more aware of this process of framing within us. And filmmaker and anthropologist David McDougall has a very nice concept that say the concept of corporal images, and to say that as filmmaker, we carry the imprint of an image, our image carry the imprint of our own bodies, the body that is behind the camera, and its relationship to the people that or the world we're working with. And that often, when you watch a film, you can sense, you can sense the body behind the camera. So when we film, we're always feeling from a subjective perspective, that we're aware or not of that. And it's the same without the camera. So working with the camera and the screen on Zoom, somehow it's useful to bring up to ourselves our own framing that we put onto the world. It's the idea that we are moving camera ourselves. So I try to get people to move with that in mind, and also realize that we are a three-dimensional being. So we're not just this flat screen. So I'm receiving the world not just from the side and my eyes, but from all directions. And also my framing is changing, shaping, and it also really change depending on where I am in the world. And it's becoming more aware that I'm also part of a bigger composition, that we are in constant dialogue and co-creation with the environment, so becoming more aware of that. So to conclude, I would just like to make 3 points, which is, as I just explained, somehow moving on Zoom, but also filmmaking is a way to critically reflect and bring to awareness our own habits of framing the world and its biases. And then the second point I'd like to make is that the screen doesn't make us disembodied per se, but it accentuates an existing lack of awareness in the role of a body in seeing, and also it accentuates this lack of awareness of our own biases in perceiving and thinking that the focal vision is our main mode. But somehow the screen is also amplifying this problem, and it gives us, as I say, an opportunity to look into it. And somehow for me, there is creative opportunity in that, and to bring other ways of doing this. And then lastly, beyond Zoom, I'm interested in how we can be more critical of our use of technology from a body perspective, by questioning it through movement in a way that enhance our physical abilities rather than constrain them. So therefore, how can we bring the body more at the heart of how we interact with technology? And how can we keep a more critical body-centered thinking attitude? And I'd like just to come back to what I invited you to do at the beginning, and how was that journey of just keeping track of how you were with yourself as you were listening and watching me. And there is no right or wrong with that. There is just a noticing. So just remind that. And very last, I will just say that I'll be really delighted to hear any feedback and anyone interested in similar questions. So please do get in touch. And I'm also going to be running a new series of workshops on this moving with the screen. So if you have any interest with that, do get in touch as well. I don't know if my details are somewhere, but I can write them in the chat if not. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Wow, I think that was a really productive progression through those presentations.
It was very well curated. Thank you.
I think credit goes to you all. So if you have questions for the panelists, either as a whole or individually, you can pop them in the chat, or we're very happy to have you unmute yourself and pose a question. You can raise your hand either through Zoom or in your body, and we can go from there. I just wanted to note, so something I've been thinking about is that domestic space has been part of especially popular screen dance for a really long time. This is something Archer's work has accounted for, and I've talked about it myself, even as early as 2014. The music video for Beyonce's 7-Eleven emulates this by pretending to be an amateur home video. But what has struck me for the first time in hearing your presentations is that it's not the same space. It's not the same place. So even the exact same home is a different environment now than it was before. And as Claire just showed us so vividly, our physical relationship to the place, in addition to its social and political meaning, has changed. And so I just want to say thank you for making that so clear, everyone, in your works presented together. Does anyone want to pose a question? Looking for hands.
Ariadne has posted a question / observation in the chat.
Yeah, so this is something, Harmony, that you also were starting to ask about is, Archer, would you mind elaborating more on your closing statement that perhaps the home body has always been in crisis? And Ariadne particularly points to the fact that domestic violence may be an instantiation of that argument.
Absolutely, yeah. So I came to this project, the study of home dance videos on Instagram, through kind of a fascination with the gaze and the power of the gaze, and how it creates a tension between the unseen and the seen. And that was evident with Claire's discussion also with the frame. Like if I go outside of the frame, there's a lot of suggestion around what's unseen exactly. So there's a power to the gaze, and thinking about surveillance also, and how the surveilled, if I can, that's a word, the surveilled body is kind of manifests that tension between being somewhat at ease and strangely being projected with some sense of authenticity, or being the natural body, being a pure body because it is understood to be beyond the gaze and unaware of a gaze. And at the same time, the fact that the body is always performing no matter what. So there's already a tension there. And then to layer on top of that, the performance that happens on new media. So kind of preparing oneself for new media performance and almost orchestrating that element of authenticity for a very, very wide audience. So the authenticity wasn't there in the first place. And then there's another layer of it, another film on the film of authenticity. So I hope that kind of gets at Harmony's question about that tension between being at ease, but the homebody always being in crisis. It's always seen to be natural, but also and fetishized for that natural and authentic sense. And something that needs to be disciplined as well, because I studied #caught dancing videos where somebody catches a person dancing. They do not know at first that they're being recorded and they're kind of dancing in their home. And we've all heard the phrase too, dance like nobody's watching, right? There's this understanding of what the unseen dancing body looks like and acts like. And then once it's caught, you're like, oh, you should feel embarrassed for being caught by this camera, by this gaze, the gaze of the person, the gaze of the camera, and the gaze of the audience beyond the camera. So then there's this like disciplinary element there as well. The question about domestic violence is another good one. I mean, that's a whole level of crisis that that is just beyond that tension between the inside and the outside, the unseen and the seen. But it's still there. Like the tension between the unseen and the seen also is present with cases of domestic violence. And I'm interested in how that, I think that there in that question, there was a mention of like screen dance with domestic violence, which
that is a component of just domesticity that's largely unseen.
Yeah, how it remains
still
invisible in screen dance. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something to really think about, because especially with the preparations that people make for new media, people are always saying kind of, this life isn't real. This is kind of pretend performed for this audience. And it doesn't really get at the strife and the grief and the difficulty of home life. So I appreciate that comment. And I think that it really is important to think about.
I would maybe just jump in and say, I don't know that it is unseen in screen dance, because I think that we also have a lot of aestheticization of the kind of violent dynamic things that you can do with bodies, and that what borders on or crosses the line in terms of domestic violence achieves a level of aesthetic interest because of the way things can be edited. So I think that there's really an interesting question about what is seen and unseen, what is visible and not visible, as we're thinking about, how big is this category of screen dance? If we're looking at popular screen dance as it circulates on Instagram, that's going to be a platform specific image of the domestic as compared to aesthetics that have evolved inside of filmmaking or dance filmmaking, more specific, not more specifically, but like that discipline as we were talking about earlier.
Sorry, I think I messaged Harmony personally, not to the group, but I said yes, and consent too. So the role of consent with new media performance, the caught dancing example is one of those, but also like how does consent play out on the platform itself and in circulation with things like reposting or saving videos. And it gets kind of to the question of ownership and authorship that folks touched on in the roundtable yesterday. Yeah, a lot of touchstones here.
I do think Harmony may be getting to the point that you were making too, that there's been a lot of opportunity to interrogate what is being included in dance and who is being included in dance in this moment of both furious screen making, but also many people not dancing. And I think one of the things that has been addressed in different ways is like, I think I saw a piece called "Stop Throwing Women Around," in regards to a lot of the partnering that we see in contemporary work. And so it's interesting to think about sort of the seen unseen, what's this moment allows us to interrogate. Yeah. Are there other questions?
Kyra has a comment in the chat. I don't know, Kyra, if you want to represent it or if you want us to read it out loud. I'll read it out loud. Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Kyra.
There I am. Hi, hello. Yeah, I'm happy for you to read it out loud, but it's just a general observation, really. Thank you very much for all your presentations. I've really been enjoying that. I was just thinking that particularly in this last year, I think a comment Catherine made about sort of being kind of propelled into working with the screen, not necessarily by choice for a lot of us, more so this year, particularly in teaching, is this idea of needing to use screen media as a space for process and a sort of sharing of, yeah, rather than kind of finished product delivery mechanism for sharing kind of processes and finding strategies for that in the domestic space and also in studio spaces generally. So it's just a thought around that, really.
I guess to elaborate on that, I was thinking, Joe, in your remarks, you captured a unique moment, which was something that was already in the works, had a mode of delivery. I guess Hetty, you too, existing works that then found a new expression, as opposed to things that were made only because or directly because of the pandemic. So I don't know if you, either of you, would like to talk more a little bit about those shifts or the reasons to continue to restage.
I think it's one of those curiosities, because we'll never know. But I am so fascinated by the idea of, it was always the maker's intention to eventually turn the installation into a film, and I'm just so curious to know what it would have been like had it had that life as an installation first, and the maker had experienced and seen and witnessed how the audience were interacting with it, and how that might have influenced the work as a film, and also that time pressure, and how that changed the directive of the maker in turning it into a linear single screen film. And I can't actually remember whether it was this talk or the talk before that someone was talking about the importance of I think it was this one, of the process, and the work as a product of the process and the circumstances under which it's made. And I think Tom was everything that it was sort of supposed to be, and sort of landed kind of pretty perfectly in its time. The fact that it was available as a single screen film in the home to everybody at that time, coupled with its themes of loneliness and isolation, was just kind of some freakishly fortunate thing of the universe that came about. And yeah, I mean I will be, because of that, my experiences of that, I will be super keen to see it in its installation form. But I wonder what the makers feelings about the work will be, and how they will have changed, having had such positive responses from audiences as a single screen film.
Sorry, Catherine, did you want to go?
Go ahead, Hetty.
Thanks. I think, thanks, Alex, for the question. I think it really touched on something quite interesting about looking at Perch, particularly through this lens, for want of a better word, of screen dance, because it did very much start as a non-screen practice. And even in the first stages of the adaptation the work was happening remotely over a screen. So, you know, responding to Kyra's point about the kind of screen being a platform for practice, it very much was, but the decision to put it online, I think, came a bit later on in that process. And both Katie and Amy have talked about the kind of apprehension, excuse me, that they felt about that transition, about it becoming an online work. And I think, you know, one of the really interesting things about this piece is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's first and foremost a practice. And this idea of like the processual qualities, you know, in its very beingness is about process. And yet somehow through the kind of recording and dissemination in that format, there's a kind of a workness that kind of arises that kind of stabilizes it in some way. So I think there's something really interesting about thinking about it as screen dance, and especially in relation to, as Kyra was saying, you know, the kind of process and the way that the screen can kind of facilitate that, but also kind of capture it in a way.
Catherine?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm so appreciating the focus on process and so many of the things that are being presented and talked about, and I think that it's really helpful to me because it's helping me to think about, you know, as artists and as educators, we're all up against institutional norms and systemic norms in our society, and within the academy. We kind of like to do things the way they've always been done. There's definitely something similar between, I think, Joe, you brought up gaming and how it creates like an interactive relationship. And Claire, you're also sort of talking about this. And I think, Hetty, what you're talking about with the these scores and these axiological domains, and Archer with the agency of people choosing to film themselves. I mean, there's a lot of actual interactivity here that in many ways runs parallel to progressive pedagogies, which are all about dialogic interactions and creating community and creating connection that is really interactive. And that is really antithetical to the way a lot of institutions run through that kind of banking model of education, where you're just going to, you know, be a witness, you're going to kind of passively absorb whatever's being handed to you. And so it's interesting for me to think about, you know, the institution that I'm coming from, because it's this kind of old school place. It had then a really old school relationship to what screen dance would be. And it's just so exciting, I think, to hear these conversations that are really engaging in the nuances of interactivity with this medium, what that means in relation to process and agency and things like that. And I just really wanted to highlight and celebrate that, and that there's a lot of little light bulbs in my mind that are sparking in relation to the kinds of processes we're talking about and how they relate to progressive pedagogy as educators, since as educators, we're all navigating this world as well as artists.
I think that, Catherine, you just perfectly wrapped up the themes and concerns of these presentations. I went ahead and put in the chat people's handles on Twitter, and I encourage everyone to keep this conversation going there, as well as the Jamboard that Harmony mentioned. Thank you so much for an invigorating and illuminating conversation.